Welcome to BigTent USA. My name is Liz Fuller. I'm an advisor at BigTent. And here at BigTent, we're steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with facts and calls to action so you can become a stronger, more effective advocate for our country. We have two important calls to action this morning supporting organizations in Minnesota. They are Joyce's Uptown Food Shelf and Minnesota Immigration Rights Action Committee. And we'll put links to both of those in the chat. And we really want to emphasize that here at BigTent, we stand with the people of Minneapolis, and we also stand with people in any city where ICE is in residence. So we are thrilled to welcome back Ann Applebaum, Judd Legum, and Charlie Sykes to BigTent. It's impossible to whittle down these fabulous resumes, but we'll try. Ann is a staff writer for The Atlantic and author of the best-selling 2020 book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Her latest book, Autocracy, Inc. Ann is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the SNF Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 20th century propaganda. Judd Legum is the founder and author of Popular Information, an independent newsletter dedicated to accountability journalism. Popular Information won the 2020 Online Journalism Award for Excellence in Newsletters and the 2025 David Nyan Prize for Public Policy Journalism. Its reporting was credited by Bloomberg for bringing a, quote, political reckoning, close quote, to corporate America. And Charlie Sykes is the author of the Substack newsletter, to the contrary, and contributes to The Atlantic and to MS Now. His most recent book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, published by St. Martin's Press, was released in October 2017. Ann, Judd, and Charlie, thank you so much for coming back to BigTent USA. Now, Charlie, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. And we have a lot of ground to cover, obviously. Looking back at the last 2 weeks, we need to talk about Donald Trump's global power grab. We also need to talk about the rise of authoritarianism and the wave of corruption that has become almost normalized. But let's start with this. 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump was posing as the master of the universe. He was talking about swallowing whole countries, going to Davos, very, very clear swagger. And yet in the last 2 weeks, he's had to back off twice. He has had to back down on Greenland and appears to be trying to recalibrate or de-escalate in Minneapolis. So let's talk about both of those. I guess the first big question is whether or not the panelists think that what do you make of the pivot? We now have Kristi Noem has been sidelined. Greg Bovino has been sacked. Tom Homan has been dispatched to Minneapolis. So let me just start with Judd. Are you buying the spin that Donald Trump is backing down, or that he's pivoted in some fundamental way in Minneapolis? How should we regard this?
I think you need to look at it from two dimensions. There's certainly the political dimension, and certainly there was a desire by the White House to communicate that there was going to be some kind of change because they saw the political winds changing. And I think they've largely been successful in communicating that through a lot of major media organizations. Then I think there's a separate question of, has anything on the ground really changed? And if you look carefully at the coverage from the people who are there, and also if you consider what has been said, not just necessarily the rearranging of who's in charge of the area, but what has been said about how they're going to proceed, nothing yet has substantively changed. And I think Tom Homan, although he clearly has more of a background as someone who's worked with Democrats and Republicans, if you look at his conduct from the beginning of the Trump administration. I mean, he has been on the front lines advocating the use of the military in United States cities to help enforce immigration law. He's been advocating for using Gitmo to hold migrants. He's been defending deporting children who are U.S. citizens because their parents are being deported at the same time. So I don't think just because he's involved, that necessarily means there's going to be a substantive pivot. Now, we'll have to see how things play out. But I think the reality is on the ground, there's still a very aggressive crackdown that's going on, and it remains to be seen whether there will be any changes.
And Donald Trump, rarely backs down the way that we've seen in the last 2 weeks, or at least, appears to be. And I agree with Judd's take on what's happening in Minneapolis. But, with Greenland, obviously, you had the nation's pressure from the nation states of what's left of the free world. In Minneapolis, and very interested in getting your take on all of this, it appears to be at least a temporary victory or a success by these little platoons of Minnesotans with cell phones who've organized themselves. For people wondering, can we do something? Is it possible actually to stop all of this? Minneapolis is a case. Can you put this in some, larger context? Have you seen this kind of pro-democracy movement having some success that we can draw upon?
So I do want to talk about Greenland because it's a really interesting
Yeah.
example of how to push back against Donald Trump
Yes.
that came from the international community. But so yes, Minneapolis, there's been some fantastic reporting, actually in the Atlantic, I'm happy to say, both from Robert Worth and Adam Serwer, talking about how the kind of ground operation is organized, and people are using pseudonyms, and they
Mm.
use whistles to tell people, to warn people when ICE is coming. People move around different parts of the city. And I have to tell you, it reminded me a lot of other democracy movements and other protest movements we've seen in other parts of the world. I don't know to what extent the leaders, although there aren't leaders, which is another feature of a lot of modern democracy movements, there isn't a single leader or a single structure. It reminded me a lot of how they have worked in other places. So the Hong Kong democracy movement, which which involved a huge part of the city and was very successful. It was actually destroyed partly by COVID, and COVID allowed the
Mm.
Chinese government to put in restrictions on it. But it had some similarities in that it happened in different parts of the city, and there was no single leader, and there was no structure. Instead, they had this expression, be like water, show up, move to wherever you're needed at any given moment. And it looks like that's some version of that is happening in Minneapolis. So there are people who aren't, none of them are full-time agitators. They're just people who, if they happen to be in the right neighborhood at the right time, come over and help. And that implies it implies a pretty deep kind of organization. It's not one that we're used to seeing. Again, there's not a single leader. There's not a charismatic person. There seem to be some committees, but there isn't a single group or committee. In that sense, it's different from even American protest movements in the past. But rather, it's using the tools of the internet, using people who can help when they can, to move the protest around and make it work. And it also implies that a lot of people are involved, not necessarily, as I said, full time, but there are a lot of people who care enough to show up and help some of the time. And we've seen some video clips from Minneapolis of people saying exactly that. I'm not a protester. I'm not in politics. I'm just so mad about what's happening that I felt like I had to be here. And I think it's new in America. I mean, it's a new way of organizing protest, and it's a new way of drawing people who are normally not political into politics.
I want to come back to Greenland in just a moment, but Judd, my sense is that the images that have come out of Minneapolis, whether you're talking about Renee Good, whether you're talking about the elderly gentleman who was a U.S. citizen who was dragged out of his home in freezing weather in his underwear by ICE, whether it is the 5-year-old little boy who was used as bait, and of course all the images of Alex Preddy, that this has had a fundamental impact on public opinion. And we have been asking for the last 10 years, what will make a difference? What will break the normies? What will move the needle? Whatever other pundit-like cliche you want to use. But give me your sense of how that played out, because this felt like it broke through in a way that very few other stories have broken through to the normies, the non-political folks out there. Give me your sense of how big a deal that was and how that happened.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is something distinct about what's happening as opposed to, the general kind of avalanche of news that's put upon us every single day. And to me, it really comes down to those visuals, the video, because the Trump administration quite successfully implements the same type of playbook whenever there's any potentially negative story, which is seed nothing, attack your opponents or the people who are garnering sympathy as aggressively as possible, and really just double down on whatever you were doing that's the subject of criticism. And that certainly is the case. They took both the route they took both with Renee Good and then with Alex Preddy after both of their deaths. And I think it was, I wouldn't say it was successful with Renee Good, but they certainly seemed to be just staying the course. But I think with this latest death and the videos that were surrounding it, just the disconnect between what people were seeing and what was being said
Yes.
was so stark that no matter who you are, even if you were inclined maybe to give Trump the benefit of the doubt or just inclined not to pay too much attention to it, it's all just accusations being traded. It was these videos, whether it's the video of the shooting or whether it's the video of, this 5-year-old child who's being paraded around by a, masked ICE agent. I think that has a resonance, especially in our culture today, which is very attuned to absorbing videos. I mean, that's what people are
Yeah.
processing, not necessarily a debate that's playing out, by just people trading accusation or in text. So yeah, I do think, we'll have to see. And I think also it's important to recognize that January is a long time from November. So
It
things
is.
are changing. There's plenty of times for things to change back and forth, both directions from where we are now. But I do think there's been a change.
So, and one of the things that struck me was the Trump folks, I think, had the theory of the case that the American public would embrace this kind of chaos, would embrace this kind of strength. In fact, what we are seeing is that these images that we've been talking about are offending Americans' innate sense of decency, and there is this huge backlash, and that innate sense of decency is really one of the most crucial guardrails against authoritarianism and against the Trumpian project. They, I think, thought that they had softened up the ground, that people would go, yeah, these people deserve that kind of treatment, but they aren't. So just talk to me a little bit about this, because, right now, Trump's what seemed like an almost unstoppable roll toward autocracy has come up against the American people saying, no, that's not who we are. That's not who we want to be.
So I think that the ICE raids, plus the use of the National Guard and others, had several purposes. One of them was to stage a kind of spectacle of performative cruelty.
Yes.
And the best example of that was in Chicago, right, much earlier in the last year, when there was a raid on an apartment building in Chicago,
Mhm.
and they did use Black Hawk helicopters and guys in dressed for Fallujah, and they had and they filmed themselves in a kind of video game kind of way, like it was an attack on a bunch of terrorists. It turned out later that there was nobody in the building who was a criminal of any kind, and the lots of U.S. citizens there were thrown out on the street. There was a lot of chaos, and that looked like a performance. And we are performing dominance, we're performing cruelty. and the point of that was both to inspire and provoke their base to say, yeah, this is what we wanted. We're getting revenge on our enemies. We're getting rid of the immigrants and the criminals who we said we didn't want. And of course, I think it was also designed to scare and intimidate people, so that they would see this TV-like, video game-like spectacle and be afraid. And you're right that the performance has run into a backlash, in that there are a lot of Americans who may be apolitical, or who maybe even are conservative, or inclined to be skeptical of the left or whatever. They don't see themselves as as Democrats, but in fact the spectacle of cruelty offended them, because actually it's very un-American. I mean, sure, we attack terrorists in foreign countries, and we can argue about whether that was a good thing to do or not, but that was focused outwards. And to have something like that focused inward, and especially as in Minnesota, it's been clear that it's focused on U.S. citizens, much clearer there than it was elsewhere.
Yes.
Two American citizens have died. That, I think, has crossed a line for people, and they don't identify with it as the America that they know. It's not what they want to see from the American government.
Well, there's not a bright red line between foreign policy issues right now and domestic politics, because the rest of the world is watching this, aren't they? So I wanted to get your sense of, what is the rest of the world thinking? I was, reading some of the reaction of Italians when they found out that ICE agents were going to be going to the Milan Olympics, and you got a sense that all the rest of the world is watching all of this. So give me a sense, Anne,
this is a really important. I mean, it's also
Yes.
happening because it happened in conjunction with Greenland.
Exactly.
Let me actually
Yes.
back up just 1 second and
Yeah.
say what happened in the few days before Davos.
Hmm.
Remember, there was that strange letter that Trump wrote to the Norwegian prime
Hmm.
minister, this text message in which he said, I used to be in favor of peace, but you won't give me the Nobel Prize. So, now I'm not in favor of peace anymore. There was, threatening language from Trump in several official statements. And there were a lot of European leaders and European military leaders and intelligence lead officers who genuinely believed that it was possible that an invasion of Greenland was about to begin. And
Really.
there were serious military preparations beginning in Denmark and elsewhere. I wouldn't say there was a panic, that's the wrong word, but there was a sudden reaction to the idea that the United States is not our friend has been around for a long time in Europe, but the idea that the United States might actually be our enemy and be a hostile threat to Europe suddenly became very, very real for a few days. And that happened at the same time as people saw on television. They see the same clips from Minnesota that we do. Actually, I was in Norway yesterday, and the colleagues there were saying, it's weird, we spend as much time on Norwegian television watching Minnesota right now as we do our own politics. U.S. politics is front page news in every single country in Europe and in the world. I mean, not just Europe, India, Latin America, everywhere. They're all seeing the same pictures. And the combination of, this vision of a, fully armed, militarized police on the street of America shooting American citizens who dared to object, and the prospect of a U.S. military invasion of a European country happening at the same time really created this sense of profound change. And this is when you got the speech from Mark Carney, who was actually echoed by a lot of other people saying similar things, saying this is not a transition to a new kind of political system. This is a rupture. The America that we've known, for the last 70, 80 years is gone, and we are in a new world, and we all need to think differently about how we're going to be allied and how we're going to behave. And the reason why his speech got so much attention, I mean, a speech by a Canadian prime minister, like, why is that a big deal? Was because it resonated. Because it was someone saying what everybody was thinking, that this is not just some kind of new U.S. policy or something, but it's a profound change. And although the Europeans did push back, and they sent troops to Greenland, and they There, you began to see a reaction on markets, and there was sudden talk of European tariffs and maybe selling U.S. bonds, and you saw a little mini market crash. And then I think that did make Trump pull back. I think there aren't many things that move them, but crashing markets do. He understands that
Yes.
as something symbolic. What you also saw was the beginning of people saying, no, we've played along with this enough. We paid lip service to the project. We went, we thought if we were nice to him and we flattered him, we bribed him, that would be enough. And now we see it's not. And there's a really big shift happening. I mean, it's happening really around the world. I mean, it's most striking in Europe, but it's everywhere.
It did strike me, rereading Carney's speech where he talks about the rupture that historians might look back on that as one of the real pivot points, the genuine pivot points, not the ones we talk about, from news cycle to news cycle, and I was reminded of when, Winston Churchill went to Fulton, Missouri, and gave his, Iron Curtain speech, which really drew the line, marking, that the world is different. We're going into a Cold War. I think that I personally thought that the Carney's address was at that level. Judd, I want to ask you this because I read your newsletter every single day, and with all of the things that are going on, the cruelty, the performative brutality, the imperialism, the bullying, and everything, in a different world, we would be talking about the open, brazen corruption of things like. Well, on a regular basis, it has almost become a secondary story. We have, to put it mildly, we've never seen anything remotely like, Donald Trump's willingness to enrich himself and his buddies and his cronies. He rules with fear and favor. So, talk to me a little bit about this. How does the Board of Peace figure into all of this? Because it really looked like kind of a United Nations for misfit toys. What were your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it does play into how foreign policy has been turned into a vehicle for uh, Trump and his family to enrich themselves. And alliances are being formed, um, not so much in the general interest of the country, but in, what are the things that can advance the Trump organization and others that are pursuing developments. And I think, part of the idea of the Board of Peace, and you saw Jared Kushner, who's obviously played a key role in this, making a speech talking about, these gleaming skyscrapers that are going to be, built in Gaza. That's a bit of a fantasy, of course, with Hamas still not disarming and even the ceasefire itself being extremely tenuous. I don't think you're going to see too many people building luxury skyscrapers in that environment. But there are very real things going on. It was interesting, just to give you one example. It was interesting when the second Trump administration started. The first administration, there was a self-imposed ethics rule saying the Trump organization will not do any foreign deals for the length of the presidency. In the second Trump administration, they threw that out and they only had an even narrower exemption, which is no deals with foreign governments. But then we've seen just now the Trump organization making a deal in a new development in Saudi Arabia that's 100% funded by the Saudi public, public investment fund. And striking a multi-billion-dollar deal with the Trump organization to build luxury residencies and a golf course and all of that. So even that small kind of nod to say, well, we couldn't make a deal with explicitly with a foreign government, that's being thrown out the window. And I think the general sort of constant chaos moving from sort of one crisis to another, whether it's Greenland or Venezuela or ICE and things going home, serves as sort of a smokescreen for this. When even if you look at during the Clinton presidencies or the Obama presidencies or even the Bush presidencies, Republicans and Democrats, even a whiff of something
Yes.
even close to this would have literally been the dominant story for weeks or months. Now barely gets a mention.
So, and I want to get your take on this board on the board of peace. Is Donald Trump actually trying to create a new world order in his own image? Is he trying to create a new network of like-minded oligarchs? What was that about? What was your take on that?
So there are many, many weird things about the Board of Peace.
Many.
One of them is that it is not at all clear that this is a US government project. So
Hmm.
any kind of foreign treaty in the, involving the United States has to be passed by the Senate. And this is not something that would pass the Senate. I think you need two-thirds of the Senate, in fact, to pass a foreign treaty, and this is not passable. The head of it is Donald Trump. Donald Trump appoints the members and invites people. He can also disinvite people. It looks like he gets to choose the next head as well. So maybe it's inheritable. Maybe it goes to his sons or someone of his choice or his son-in-law. He also the board can vote on things and come to a and have opinions, but the chairman can overrule the vote. In other words, this is a private organization that's run by Donald Trump and in which Donald Trump gets to dictate all the rules. And the
Staggering.
European and other democratic governments, and even I imagine some non-democratic governments, looked at this charter, the description of it, which nobody's fully paid. So many else has been going on that it's been hard to pay a lot of attention to it. They looked at it
Yes.
and they said that is unsignable. No normal government could sign up to an arrangement like that. If that's going to, but it does seem that there is some implication in the language that this is going to replace the UN. We won't
Yes.
need the UN Security Council. Instead, we'll have the Board of Peace, and the Board of Peace will oversee Gaza, and maybe it will oversee Donbass there, or other parts of the world. But it's much more bizarre, I think, than people have realized. And I think the fact that only dictatorships and very illiberal countries have signed so far, and that Russians have said they would sign, Belarusians said they would sign, Viktor Orban's Hungary, is because only those countries can. I mean, everybody knows it's a joke, stipulate. I mean, everyone who signed it knows that it's not real, but they can, for whatever personal reasons, the dictator or the leader can sign knowing they're signing up to something that's meaningless. I mean, a
Sure.
Democratic leader can't do that, right? You can't sign something if you're the prime minister of Finland because your parliament would complain about it, and you have legal responsibilities. And in countries where leaders don't have that, they can sign it. The $1 billion is also a weird thing. So some will know that the
Hmm.
members, supposedly there's a term of 3 years, and if you want to be a permanent member, you have to pay $1 billion to the chairman, basically. So
To the chairman.
it's unclear, but to the
Yeah.
board or to the chairman, or the chairman controls the money. I don't think anybody's signed up to pay that yet, and so I don't think we'll get that far. But I mean, it's a very weird, very bizarre, and very strange thing that has clearly not been created by the U.S. government or anyone who is a serious part of it. I mean, maybe Trump had some lawyers draw it up for him who, it reads like a golf club charter or something. Um, but I think it's expressive of his state of mind. It does accurately see how he thinks he should run the world. He's in charge. Everybody else has to do what he says. He brings in money, and then he makes all the decisions. And that's actually how the international community should work. And as I said, nobody's taking this seriously anywhere. And the only people who will sign it are people who know it's meaningless, or who don't care that it's meaningless. But
So
it's a bizarre
yeah.
document.
I want to get to the question in the Q&A in just a moment. One small question. You probably saw this story out of Politico about Slovakia's prime minister told EU leaders at a summit last week that a meeting with Trump left him shocked by the U.S. president's state of mind. Robert Fico, who's one of the few EU leaders who kind of is Trump adjacent, kind of a fan, MAGA fan, was so concerned about Trump's psychological state that he actually used the word dangerous to describe meeting the president. So, what are the implications that even the people who are willing to appease Donald Trump are saying there's something wrong with this guy? I mean, is
Yeah,
that kind of the sense the buzz in Europe that this is not a well man? I mean, leaving aside fascist authoritarianism, what the hell is going on with Donald Trump?
yeah, I mean, that story bothered me because they didn't say what exactly it was that Fizzo said or what he heard,
Yeah,
and I felt that it
yeah,
was,
yeah.
it was a little empty. But no, yes, I mean, everybody who deals with the president has known for a long time that it's a strange experience, and I've heard a lot of very
Mhm.
different strange stories. But as I said, I think the run up to Davos, when this strange letter to the Prime Minister of Norway, the ranting about Greenland and I have a psychological need to have Greenland, he said in one interview. I mean, I think that was a moment when people said, right, there's something very wrong here. And we're none of us out here in the world I live in are psychiatrists or doctors. I mean, we can't say what exactly it is. That's not our role, but clearly there's something that's not it's he's lost touch with some reality in some way. I mean, the Board of Peace is another example.
Yeah.
There's, these are his projects are so fantastical, and the language he's using is so divorced from reality that you have to say, yes, something's seriously wrong.
Okay, so let's go to some of the questions from the audience in the chat and questions that you have submitted in advance. Judd, I'm going to throw this one to you. How concerned should we be about the risks that the 2026 midterm elections could be delayed, compromised, or eliminated? And a number of people have mentioned the fact that the FBI has just raided a Georgia election facility, weaponizing the big lie from 2020. So, how concerned should we be about election interference from Donald Trump and his cronies?
Yeah, I think there's reason to be concerned. I think that it's not necessarily some sort of binary where Trump is going to, give a speech and declare that the 2026 elections are canceled for this reason or that. I don't think that's the primary concern, but I think there is concern about efforts that Trump is making in advance to potentially undermine confidence in the outcome. Obviously, we have this raid in Georgia, which is really trying to fuel kind of long debunked theories about what went on during the 2020 election, and just sort of underscores that we have an FBI who's essentially operating as a arm of the White House and the presidency. But something that's been going on a lot longer, and that has been the subject of litigation, that is something that I've been paying close attention to, is this effort by the Department of Justice to collect and centralize all of the voting rolls for all states.
Yes.
And I think using that, if you look at the organizations, True the Vote and others, who have been involved in trying to undermine confidence, it's a lot of the times their efforts involve, taking these disparate government databases, kind of smashing them together and spitting out a number of, okay, we found 100,000, ineligible voters. Now, a lot of this is because the data is just, they're not doing the matching correctly. They're
Yeah.
trying to compare apples and oranges, but that's how it is done. And we actually have saw a a confluence, kind of astoundingly, between this effort and the what's going on right now in Minneapolis, because Pam Bondi sent a letter to the governor of Minnesota saying, "Hey, we may pull out, but what you have to do is these several things," and one of them was turn over your
Ooh.
voting rolls. So I think there's right to be concerned. Everyone should pay attention to this. There's a lot of states that have been fighting these efforts. I think there's about a dozen states that have complied, 20 plus that are fighting these efforts. So I think it's important to be aware, to be concerned, but I don't think it is helpful to to be fatalistic about it, that the essentially the trust and the impact of the election results depends on people participating uh, and people investing themselves in it. So kind of turning away and viewing it as all rigged, I think is the wrong approach. I
Okay.
think there are efforts to undermine it, and those efforts are worth paying attention to.
And you've been warning about the creeping rise of authoritarianism. Your thoughts about the election, because there are a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety about the that this administration is already proven its willingness to try to overturn an election. Stephen Miller's talking about the iron laws of history, right? You know, the strong can swallow the weak. Well, one of the iron laws of history is the strong do not give up their power. So where do you come down? How alarmed, how concerned, how paranoid should people be about 26 and 28?
So I agree actually with what Judd just said. I mean, so there are actually multiple efforts to impact the election and shape the
Mm.
election before it happens. There's one of them is this project to do with voter rolls, and there are this, as Judd said, there are these ongoing lawsuits. Um, it may well be that ICE or other armed forces could be used on the streets around elections, perhaps in blue cities or somewhere else where there are a lot of Democratic. I believe it's illegal to have armed people in a voting polling station, but you could imagine them on the street as a way to intimidate people from going to vote, and they seem to be preparing for that. There is a there's the federal pressure on states to redistrict, to gerrymander,
Yeah.
which is, by the way, gerrymandering, very old tradition in American politics, but
Yeah.
there has never been a federal pressure on states as there was on Indiana, and there has been on some other states to change the voter districts in order to benefit the president's party. So there's all kinds of small things going on, and they're clearly seeking to shape the ground. I actually think that the takeover or whatever is the correct term of TikTok,
Mm.
the sale or partial sale of some TikTok to Trump friendly businesses is also part of this, because we know that younger voters get a lot of their political information from TikTok, and it may be that the TikTok algorithm is changed to help the Republicans win the midterm. So I think they're thinking about this in a lot of different places. None of which means that a really big turnout and a really big effort and the work of all of the amazing lawyers who've been working on elections and
Yeah.
monitoring elections, for the last several years, still doesn't mean we can't win. But it's really important for people to pay attention to each one of these challenges and to find ways to push back. I mean, actually, we've sort of forgotten about it because of all the other things that have happened. Governor Newsom's decision to have that vote in
Hmm.
California to redistrict California, which actually, I mean, I'm against redistricting
Yeah.
for political reasons, but I understand why he wanted to do it at this particular moment. I mean, that was a really important change. And it's really, it's important that Democratic states also, if those are going to be the rules of this new of this election season, then we should then they'll have to push back too. So you see people are pushing back, and I hope that the possibility of pressure on the election will just encourage more people to vote.
So, Jed, we have a lot of questions about what Democrats should do, Democratic strategy. But here's one specific one. A lot of buzz over the last week about whether or not Democrats in Congress should try to impeach Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem. Now, there are those who are also suggesting, look, she'd be a useful scapegoat. You get rid of her. You don't change the policy. You don't change it. But what do you actually think in terms of strategy? A number of things on the table right now. Possibility of impeaching some of these officials. Today, there's going to be a vote in the United States Senate on whether to fund DHS. What would your recommendation be to Democrats in Congress right now? What should they be focusing on?
Well, I think it's important to try to exercise the power that you have. That's, I think, a mistake that was made, over the summer when there was just, essentially traded away the leverage with government funding for very little. But you also want to be able to be successful. So, impeachment, would someone who replaces Noam necessarily be better than Noam herself? It's hard to be worse at this point, as far as respecting human rights and other issues. But I think there's a real question about whether you could accomplish that with Republicans still controlling the House. It may be more likely after 2026 if Democrats gain control of the House, then you might have a more reasonable chance of impeaching Noam or someone else. I do think that there's real leverage because of the political moment that we're in, and Trump and his advisors seeing how what's happening in Minnesota is impacting his standing for the Democrats to extract real concessions before approving funding for the Department of Homeland Security and related functions. And I think that is the place where they probably have the strongest hand. I think that the slate of things that they are demanding at this point reads to me more like what you might hope to get at the end of the negotiation more than your opening salvo. It includes things like not doing warrantless search and seizures, which my understanding is already unconstitutional. But not having ICE officers wear masks, requiring them to do body cameras. Maybe you would want to start out with something more aggressive, like clawing back the 70 plus billion dollars that we added to ICE's budgetary authority at the beginning. But that's where, if I had to pick one thing, I would say go where your political momentum is, go where you have the most power in the Senate. They're going to need votes to pass this. They're not going to vote it without it. They do not want to have an extended fight about this because they do want to at least politically pivot away from it. And that's where you have the most power. You can extract some real concessions.
So I'm very conscious of the fact that we're 45 minutes into this conversation and we haven't talked at all about Ukraine or Russia. So Anne, give me your sense of where we are at. At Davos, President Zelensky showed up and said, basically he was kind of kicking Europe, like, are you going to wake up now? Are you finally going to understand what you need to do? So give me your sense of the state of diplomacy and on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine.
So first of all, to be clear, the United States doesn't give weapons to Ukraine anymore, and Ukraine is almost entirely supported by Europe, European weapons,
Okay.
European money. Ukraine also makes its own weapons now. I didn't know that that story has fully sunk in, but they make many millions of drones. I've been in some of the drone factories. They're incredibly sophisticated. Actually, it's an example of how fast you can change your country's industrial base and technology if you really have to, because these factories didn't exist 3 years ago. So Europe is supporting Ukraine, and I think Zelensky's speech was a little misinterpreted for that reason. There are a couple disturbing things about the current situation. First of all, this war is over only when the Russians stop fighting. So when the Russians say, okay, Ukraine is going to be an independent country, and we're not going to recreate the Russian Empire. And once they come to that conclusion that they can't win the war, then the war has ended. And then we can argue about where the border is. What's happening now is that the Trump administration, knowingly or unknowingly, is giving Putin this constant feeling that he still might win. By having a negotiation that seems to be allowing him to take more, putting pressure on the Ukrainians to hand over territory that the Russians don't control, by all this rhetoric about Greenland and Europe. President Trump put up a photograph of himself with President Putin in the White House. It was photographed a couple days ago in a sort of section of the White House where he also has some family photographs. He's constantly messaging and telling Putin that he's on his side. The other truly disturbing piece of the story is that while these negotiations about Ukraine are going on, there is simultaneously a separate negotiation, and this has been reported in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, of U.S.-Russian business deals. So there have been concrete offers made to specific U.S. companies, including some with contact to the Trump family. So what we're watching is a very strange kind of kabuki dance where the administration says it's in favor of peace, and Ukrainians feel obligated to go along with the theater and continue to play it out, and Europeans continue to try to influence the process. But it isn't really clear to me that the administration or the people negotiating for it really understand how to make the war end. And we're at also a really disturbing moment in the war where it's very cold in Ukraine, it's cold in Kiev, and the Russians are specifically targeting electricity and power plants so that people freeze to death. And that's beginning to happen. And it's very much, there's a kind of humanitarian crisis unfolding, and yet it doesn't seem to bother or even really interest the Trump administration. So it's a weird moment. I mean, nobody wants the U.S. to walk away because they fear that the U.S. could actually take Russia's side, and so everybody wants them in the process. But the U.S. is not taking the actions that would be needed to actually end the war, to convince the Russians that they can't win, and they simply haven't done it.
So Judd, Anne mentioned something about the corporate deals between the United States and Russia, which raises the question. There have been a lot of corporations and businesses that, have decided that hey, we can do business with this guy. We're going to get into bed with him. Is there beginning to be a little bit of buyer's remorse there? I mean, I wonder at what point does corporate America realize or begin to think that maybe getting into bed with Trump in the Middle East, in Russia, in Venezuela is perhaps not a prudent long-term business decision. You see Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, who has gone out of his way to suck up to the administration, now having to explain that really embarrassing split screen from last weekend where he's partying with Donald Trump, while the rest of the country is horrified by what's happening in Minneapolis. So give me your sense. You sense any second thoughts on the part of corporate America, Silicon Valley, the oligarchs? Answer it any way you want.
Yeah, I do not see things changing yet.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit perplexing because it almost seems like there's the expectation that the tables will never turn.
Yes.
And additionally, somebody like Tim Cook, or really, he was there at this party for this Melania
Hmm.
documentary, which itself is, I think, emblematic of how corporate America is really willing to do anything to stay in Trump's favor. I mean, this
It's
is
a
a
bribe, right?
documentary.
It's a cinematic bribe. It's Jeff
Yeah.
Bezos putting money into the Trump
I
family
mean,
pockets.
$40 million for the documentary, which she's producing about herself, another $35 million to promote this movie. If this were, in the top three documentaries of all time, they wouldn't even break even on this. I mean, this is not something that you can justify for the marketplace. Similar films, you might have a total budget of a couple of $1 million. So, but we haven't really seen a backing away of it. You don't really, and I think Minnesota is where you might you see enough momentum that you might say, well, this is where things are going to break. But the major corporations, and you can just look at the difference between 2020 and
Yeah.
today. After the murder of George Floyd, you had very strong
Yes.
statements because there's a lot of big businesses that are based in Minnesota, whether
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
Target, a huge healthcare industry there, lots of different major industries based in that state, really speaking out aggressively. And of course, this was nationwide. Um, in response to the killings of these two U.S. citizens by ICE, they finally released a statement after the second killing, but it didn't say anything. It didn't criticize, it didn't even condemn the killings themselves, no criticism of Trump, no criticism of the ICE operations, no
Yeah.
call for a drawdown. So we're not seeing it yet. Who knows what happens, but it's one of the things that I'm closely monitoring, and
Yeah.
it seems like status quo for the time being.
And Judd just said something that was very, very interesting. You would think that at a certain point there would be more executives who would realize, that they needed to slow their roll on the appeasement because the Republicans and MAGA may not always be in power. I thought it was very interesting when Jamie Dimon was asked, I think it was near the end of last year, whether or not JP Morgan was going to be contributing to the ballroom. And he said, no, we have a lot of business with government. And there may come a time when the Democrats control the Department of Justice, which I thought was a remarkably prudent thing to say. So, in your studies of authoritarian regimes, is there a tipping point where the big business, moneyed interests just decide that, okay, we're either going to go along because this is going to be the status quo is going to continue, for the foreseeable future, or they decide, no, we're going to push back? Is there some moment at which they decide that, hey, these guys may not always be in power. We got to keep that in mind.
So let me just say one thing about the United States. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a country as prosperous or one with the companies at the scale and international significance that the United States has that has tipped into authoritarianism in this classic way. So comparing what happens in the US to Venezuela or even Hungary is a little strange. I mean, we're talking about the biggest companies in the world, and their decisions. I mean, you can certainly point to history of companies going along with the regime only to discover that it destroys them. I mean, some of that happened in
Yes.
Nazi Germany. There's a famous graph of the German stock exchange. It sort of went up and up and up and up until Stalingrad, and then it collapsed and never recovered. And then that was the end of the Third Reich, and many of the companies that had been that had depended on Hitler, particularly media companies. So obviously there would be they are the well, let me say it differently. Losing the rule of law, so losing a political system in which courts are independent from politicians and in which contracts are enforceable and in which the government doesn't randomly intervene in your business should be something that all companies should fear.
Very
In other
much so.
words, the deterioration of that political system is inevitably going to be bad for everybody. I mean, at the moment, as Judd said, you see companies still trying to get in on the right side and suck up and so on. But Jamie Dimon's point was a deeper one, which is that the rule of, we have an interest in preserving the rule of law over time. So I can't tell you what the tipping point will be. I mean, maybe it would be the midterms. Maybe it will happen sooner than that. Maybe it won't happen at all. But if for companies to understand that ultimately the structure of the American political system, not just democracy, but as I said, the rule of law, the enforceability of court orders, that losing that would be bad for all of them. Maybe that there's some moment when they realize that and they band together to help. Right now, what you have is everybody acting for themselves and trying to get in, have a special relationship with the president, or find someone to pay. I have an acquaintance, let's just say, who works for a defense company, who was jokingly saying, well, my CEO of my company is looking for someone to pay. Like, we can't pay to the ballroom anymore because that's already, that's sold out. They filled that. Now they're looking for what do we pay for the arch? Trump has talked about some, people are looking for who do we pay in order to get the government contract. And I don't know how, at least at the level of joking and public, kind of chit chat, that is how people talk now about dealing with the US government. And over time, everyone's going to realize that that's bad for everybody.
So, Judd, is there any way to hold the people who are paying these open bribes accountable for all of this? I mean, this again on Earth 2.0, this would be a major, major story. If companies are sitting around thinking, what is the most prudent way of bribing the administration? You've made lists of companies that have contributed to, say, election deniers. Is there any way to hold them accountable in a real tangible way?
Well, I think that companies are certainly, um, especially consumer facing. I mean, there's different kinds of companies, right? If you're Lockheed Martin, you're probably not too vulnerable to what consumers think because there's only really one consumer for most of their products. But I do think consumer facing companies are sensitive to pressure from the public. I think what the issue has been since 2020, and we're 5, 6 years into that
Yeah,
now, is that the right has been extraordinarily organized in their own efforts to pressure these companies.
right.
And so that has, even when there's folks on the left who are trying to hold them accountable, they're very hesitant to do anything. So that's the kind of resistance that you have to
Yeah.
overcome. But I think it is possible.
It is possible. Listen, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank both Ann and Judd and all of the questions from the audience. I apologize for not getting to more of them, but of course the zone is absolutely flooded. So once again, thank everybody, and we'll turn this over to the hosts.
Anne and Judd and Charlie, you guys are the dream team, the trifecta on this day. And we're really appreciative to you and to everyone for coming to Big Tent. Let's keep the pressure up. The Senate just blocked funding of ICE. So call those 8 Republican senators and thank them on behalf of the United States of America. And to everyone, we'll see you very, very soon under the tent. Judd, Anne, and Charlie, stay safe and well. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.